All right, welcome back to PacWest Bigfoot. This is David. If you hear anything in the background, well, I've got kids. How's that sound? Anyways, welcome to the beautiful Pacific Northwest. And before we get started, real quick, next week, before I start the encounter story for the week, I'm going to be sharing out an author, a lady who has a wonderful book out, and kind of going through it right now, and I can't wait to share it with you, but I think you'll really enjoy it. Other than that, nothing else in the PacWest Bigfoot, I guess you would say, news or updates, except for I have been taking on reports on the site. If you hover over where it says blog, down below it says you can share your report. Go ahead and fill out that information in there in your report, and I'll go ahead and take that and post it to the website. Okay, so there we have it. Let's clear our throats and let's just get into this week's PacWest Bigfoot encounter story. This one from Idaho. Fisherman watches Bigfoot near Clearwater National Forest, Idaho. I am from and still live in Kooskia, Idaho. It was late winter, actually, towards the tail end of it, when I watched a Bigfoot do some of the strangest things as I was fly fishing in the Middle Fork Clearwater River that early morning. It was a shock, to say the least, to see something of legend that you've only heard from about from your dad or your grandpa while out camping come to life, especially when you get a good look at it and get to see a little behavior being played out, no matter how weird it is. Here's what happened to me and how I think Bigfoot communicate. Testing the dead drift. That Sunday morning, I was going to test out some new flies I'd tied the day before, just a few of them. Yes, the wife was a little mad at first that I was not going to be in church that morning, but she eventually let me go, and yes, I said it. She let me go. I'm usually found in church on a Sunday and watching football afterward, but that Sunday, well, I was eager to try out the first ever flies I'd tied myself. I had been fly fishing at that point for about 7 years. However, I'd never had the time to tie my very own flies between work, wife, and raising our 2 children. But in 2005-2006, I retired from 35 years as a custodian maintenance personnel with a local school district. This gave me more time with family, church outreaches I wanted to be a part of, and, of course, to dive deeper into my hobby of fly fishing in all aspects of it. Suffice it to say, I got a fly tying kit for Christmas that year. Today I still fly fish and in the same area, hoping to see what I saw that day again. Yes, I was a little scared, I have to admit. These things, and I say it as a plural thing because I believe that that was not the only one around that day, and for good reason. This thing was huge. It was unlike anything I expected it to look like, other than its size and completely covered in hair. So I had made some really cool dry flies and some cool dubbing and elk hair I bought off a hunter friend of mine. Well, I did not have to buy it. It was more or less a trade, but he gave me all he had. If you know anything about fly fishing, you'll know that deer and elk hair are great for the dead drift flies. Not that I'm a pro or anything, but I can say they work wonderfully. But instead of fly rod and reel that day, I wish I would have had a video camera or a camera, any camera for that matter, period. Fishing for Bigfoot in Clearwater. I headed out really early. I was heading out well past Syringa, about 5 miles or so, and reached my spot just as the sun was about to creep up. But more than the sun would creep up that morning. It is amazing of what you think is out here in the woods, and what is really out here all around you, and probably more often than you could imagine. I have been in and out of the woods around the Nez Perce National Forest and Clearwater National Forest for most of my life, and I have to say there were some odd moments where you get that feeling you're being watched, or it just feels weird, you know? But I think I know why now. Bigfoot. That is the reason. That creepy feeling you get out here sometimes is not a mountain lion or a bear. Nope. Sometimes it is something far bigger and far more worrisome yet wonderful all at the same time. Just thinking about it creeps me out even today, however. I pulled over at a familiar bend in the road miles outside of Syringa. It was just about to get light at that point. It was pre-dawn still, but only for about another 20 minutes. The sky at that point would start getting lighter. I pulled up the hatch on the camper shell of the old pickup truck, lowered the gate, and sat on it while I assembled my pole, reel, and tied on my new fly. Well, one of them. All the way here, I passed a few cars or more, but most were probably from the small town back down the road. Out here, where I was at the moment, was quiet, and the traffic was minimal at best during the day, and almost non-existent that early in the morning on a Sunday, for sure. The only sound I heard that morning was from across the river. I was not sure what it was, but I figured there was a cougar up the mountains beyond, screaming faintly. Cougars I had no issue with, and I had an encounter with one 20 feet away from me a few years before while fishing. Watching this thing, though, a Bigfoot across the river, even if I felt somewhat safe being on the opposite side, it still made me shiver knowing I could have been around them more than once in my life, and even closer. Anyways, it sounded somewhat like a high-pitched screaming from a cat, but I could not be sure over the water rushing so fast that time of year. But I could hear something high-pitched and screaming across the river and up the mountains that backed it. I got back to getting ready, slipping on my waders, as the sun was finally creeping up and lighting up the embankment I was about to walk down and filling the whole drainage area. I finally got situated and picked out my spot to start fishing. I was standing near a large outcropping of rocks and casting upstream and letting my fly dead drift near the first of what I could see as being at least 3 seams in that part of the river. Across the way is a sandbar, not too big or wide, but a sandbar nonetheless. Across from that are mountains with very little riverbank, maybe about 10 feet or so separated the trees and mountain from the area, or from the river. However, the trees were not as thick here as other parts of the forest. I could see through the trees pretty well. Not far, but apparently far enough. River's End. I was casting when the sun was shedding its light over the hills and mountains to the east. I was also getting some good action with the new flies I'd made, surprisingly enough. I was turning to cast again when a sound and some movement caught my attention from across and up the river a bit from me. It was a pretty long scream, must have lasted 10 or so seconds. It was also very, very scary sounding, as it started low and grew in pitch to a literal scream like, I don't know, 1,000,000 10-year-old granddaughters of mine started screaming all at once. You could almost feel it. It was so loud. That is when I noticed something walk out from the trees from the southeast of the woods and step out onto the riverbank. It was light enough to see it was on 2 legs, at least most of the time. It was also light enough at that point to see it was not a person. It was far too large and covered in hair to be a person. I also have to say I am still not 100% positive though, but I think I saw breasts on the thing. I can't say how tall it was, but my best guess would be no less than 8 feet tall, give or take a few inches either way. But that is not what caught me off guard. It was the stride this thing took as it walked, and the sheer size and sounds it made. And after about 30 seconds or so, what it would do would make me leave, quickly of course, but leave nonetheless, scratching my head. It glided right out of the woods with strides that must have been almost as long as I am tall. The color of this thing seemed dark brown, but its walk was almost mystical and weird. I'd never seen anything like it before. It seemed to almost, glide, I guess you could say. When it was parallel to me across the river, it stopped, and I stood there as still as I could and staring at this, thing. It looked in the back of itself as it turned its body and massive head back towards where it came from just moments before. It looked, I guess you could say, slightly frantic. Or it was just worried about something, but that is the feeling I got about this thing over the minute or so I watched it. But it stood there looking back up the mountain and then turned and took a few more steps along the rocky riverbank. This thing must have been heavy, too. I could hear each footfall as it walked along the rocks and gravel from across the river. It stopped again, but this time it took 2 large steps up the bank, and again it looked to its left, moving its head and upper body in the direction it had come from. I heard another scream, but this time I watched as it took the breath, leaning back a bit, then pushing it out as it leaned forward. I believe in my heart of hearts it was trying to keep something at bay. Once the scream was over, it started shaking the tree next to it so violently that it snapped in half about 7 to 8 feet up off the ground. The behavior seemed almost apish in manner, but the face, which I could barely make out, it was not completely ape-like, but did share a heavy brown line with eyes that seemed large, but sunken back like an ape. But the nose, well, it was smashed or flat, I think, but still human-like. As that thing shook and broke that tree, I slowly moved back towards the large rock formation, leaned against it and slightly behind it, keeping myself as hidden as possible, but still watching this thing. The crap stops here. Again it screamed. Next it made some loud, deep growling sounds as if as it broke a tree next to it, or next to the other one in half, about the same height up. It then took one and the other and made a cross shape out of them. It looked back up towards the mountain, ravine it had come from earlier, and started shaking more trees. After another few seconds or so of that weird behavior, it squatted down with its hands in front of it, like it was squatting like an ape on all fours, and just stood there, like a statue. No sounds, no more growling. It stood there, staring off into the woods up the river. Its behavior, and as I continue to learn more about it today from experts out here, is completely plausible, seemed to tell me that it was protecting itself from another Bigfoot. Once I started thinking about that, I started to get a little freaked out and scared. I mean, seriously, if there is something out here in the woods of Idaho that was bigger and scarier than the animal I was staring at that moment, well, yeah, that would be crazy and unbelievable. I decided it was time to start moving and getting the heck out of Dodge. I started reeling in my line, and just my dumb luck, the line was taut. I had a fish on. It did not break the surface, fortunately. I did not want this Bigfoot thing looking over at me at that time because it really seemed upset. The thought of it getting even pissier and walking across the river and killing me was something I was starting to consider could be a reality fast. I reeled it in, reached down into the water slowly, and took the fly out as quietly as possible. I felt the hook come out, and I immediately let the fish go, and the whole time I never took my eye off the Bigfoot. She sat there for what seemed a minute, then, with yet another scream, stood up and started walking around in almost circles for about 15 or so more seconds. She then slapped a tree and looked back up the river. However, this time her body and head shot right back at me. She saw me in the river. Run, Donald, run. I was staring at a Bigfoot. She was staring back at me. The moment of fear hit me like a train, fast, hard, and I was practically out of my waders by the time I jumped back and started climbing out of that river. I heard 2 distinct and loud whoops, and I did not look back to see if it was the Bigfoot and if it was chasing me from across the river. It was not, I would learn in a moment. I headed back up the embankment and did not even spend the time breaking down my rod and reel, the very reason I broke the tip on the rod and had to buy another a few weeks later. I started the car and looked back across the river to find out if it was coming across. The broken trees were knocked down, it seemed, and the Bigfoot was long gone. I told you so. I returned, and my wife gave me that look of, I told you so, about skipping church to fish after telling her what I had seen. But maybe it was a blessing after all. I would have never thought or believed these things existed this side of heaven had I not skipped out that day. But I have to be honest. I was and am today still a little nervous when out fishing that same area. But I do. I guess I am a glutton for punishment, or I simply want to witness the miracle I saw that day of a real-life Bigfoot. But that is my fishing story and wish. Thanks, Donald.